Good morning. It is Thursday, January the 13th, and this is The Drill. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the Star-Spangled Banner, we have promises, 55 Republicans, integrity, and how we got here, the 70s, Chapter 2, Part 1. All that and more when I come back. Thank you. And now for the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for January 13th. Because of who you are in me, your family is safe. My child, even though the heavens and earth may shake, I will be a shelter for my people. Be careful to obey my word so that it may go well with you and that you may increase greatly in a land flowing with milk and honey, just as I promised you. Fix my word in your heart and mind. Tie them as a symbol on your hands and bind them on your forehead. Teach them to your children when you sit at home or walk along the road or lie down to sleep. Establish my word in your home so that your days and the days of your children may be many. I will be faithful to you through all your generations. My love will stand firm forever, and I will establish your family line forever. You will live to see your children's children walking in my ways. Prayer declaration. Because I respect you, Father, and obey your laws, my field will produce, and I will be happy, and all will go well. My spouse will be fruitful, and just as an olive tree is rich with olives, my home will be rich with healthy children. And that was the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for January the 13th. Who is the true conservative? The true conservative is the person that understands that conservatism is not just political, but cultural as well. He's patriotic and uses common sense. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He is open-minded, asking why rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. In short, he is a normal American. Thank you, thank you. So I'm listening to Marco Rubio on the floor of the House, and he's talking about the January 6th. So he gets to the part where he's talking about the Democrats' administration and the Democrats are running the House. And I want to remind everybody that all of this is the Republicans' fault. The Republican Party and 55 Republicans in particular. I'm going to go and see if I can find their names so I can have them as a wall of shame. But in 2018, in the midterm elections, 55 Republicans in the House of Representatives quit. Okay, that's what opened the door to a Nancy Pelosi majority. That's the reason we have the problems we have today. That's the reason that we've got Joe Biden running amok and Nancy Pelosi, for that matter, running amok. Is that we have 55 Republicans, the people that are supposed to be representing us, the people that are supposed to be the bulwarks against socialism, abandoned their posts. They are not just absent without leave, they are deserters. In the war against socialism, they are deserters. So don't forget that. Every time you're upset with what you see and hear on the news, blame it on those 55 Republicans in the House of Representatives, because they're the ones that gave the Democrats power. Thank you. I've said it before, and it bears repeating, that you have to hold your officials accountable. We all have to hold our political representatives and office holders accountable. The question is, how do you do it? And why is it that it seems all office holders, right and left, seem to not be held accountable? They don't make promises. Politicians don't make promises anymore. What they do is they simply posture. It's all about posture and psychology now. And so they make sure that they're front and center and visible during a photo op, a pleasant activity, as a ribbon cutting. And they make sure that they're nowhere in sight when things go wrong. They stay away from the cameras as much as possible. So that's the way it's done, so that whenever you think of or picture your representative, you'll have a pleasant memory. Oh yeah, Senator Cruz. I remember. He was at that ribbon cutting. He was kissing a baby. He was doing this, that, or the other thing. So you have mainly positive images of your representative. But what it should be is you have to get them to make promises, because you can't hold them accountable if there's no standard or measuring stick by which to measure them, to measure what they have or haven't done. Donald Trump, you could measure his presidency, because you could look, he promised, although I don't think he used the word promise, but he certainly implied a promise with all of these different things. I'm going to build a wall. I'm going to move move our thing from Tel Aviv or where it was to Jerusalem. Okay, so you can measure that. I'm going to do these measurable things. The other thing our politicians have a tendency to do is talk in glittering generalities, because again, you can't measure that. They're vague and hazy. A lot of it is about, I'm going to make you feel better. And if any politician says they're going to make you feel better, directly or indirectly, make sure that you challenge them on that. Hey, I don't feel any better today, 2 years after you've taken office, than I felt 2 years ago. What's up with that? But anyways, the main way, make them promise. If you get on the phone with them, they're on a talk show, you get the opportunity to call in and talk to them, demand to know what their promise is. And if they refuse to use the word promise, you tell them, no, that's not good enough. And you're not getting my vote until you make promises, because that's how you keep them That's how you make sure, that's how you hold them accountable. No promises, no accountability. Thank you. Integrity and credibility. It just occurred to me, what's the point of having integrity? And integrity is basically you're walking your talk. If you're going to be a conservative, you don't just talk a good game, you walk the good game. That means you dress like a conservative, you talk like a conservative, you act like a conservative, you live like a conservative, okay? That's called integrity. And integrity gives you credibility, and the credibility gives you put you in a position where people are more likely to take your word for things. You don't want to have to go ahead and go and show proof for every single little thing, right? That's tedious, very tedious. But in order for you to have your people to take your word for it, you have to have integrity. People have to be able to trust you. In other words, professors were people that we used to. We don't so much anymore, thank goodness, because they've lost their integrity. They've lost their credibility. Another group that has lost their credibility and integrity are news people. So the credibility, then it means that whenever they say something, we take their word for it. It's like what I say with Walter Cronkite, for example. Walter Cronkite, if he told you the sky is falling, you took it to the bank. You took his word for it. He had outstanding, impeccable integrity and credibility. There was no conflicts of interest. I guess that's the best way to define integrity, is a situation or a person that is without conflict of interest. So now, today, it seems everyone is conflicted. Police departments, fire departments, governments at all levels are all conflicted. You can't take anybody's word for it anymore. It doesn't mean anything anymore to be even president of the United States. It just doesn't mean anything. Being a senator used to be a big deal. No, because nobody, it seems, has much in the way left of integrity or credibility. The professors have thrown it away. The scientists have thrown it away. The people that say, well, you're anti-science, and between me, you, and the fence post, you're damn right I am, because the scientists have no more credibility or integrity than anyone else. They have no more credibility or integrity than the politicians. And so that's why you want to have integrity. You want to walk the talk, because you want to have maximum credibility, especially when you're dealing with your children. You want your kids to take your word for it, because there's certain things you just can't explain. When you tell your children about how to deal with problems at school, you don't want to have to try and prove it. You're going to tell them from experience what's the best way to handle that situation. And you want them to trust you. Okay, and in order for them to trust you, you have to have maximum credibility and maximum integrity. Thank you. And now, Chapter 2 of Part 1 of How We Got Here, the 70s. The Law is Crazy. In the 1971 tough cop classic, Dirty Harry, Clint Eastwood is given the news that the deranged serial killer he has captured will be released back onto the streets of San Francisco because he violated the killer's rights. Quote, "It's the law, Harry," unquote, the exasperated district attorney tells him. Quote, "Then the law is crazy," unquote, Eastwood fires back. People expect their government to protect them from attack and assault, and before 1965, American governments had by and large succeeded. Pre-1973 crime statistics are not very reliable, but without stretching them further than they ought to go, we can say that between 1915 and 1965, the United States became steadily safer and more peaceful. Saloon brawls, range wars, lynchings, slum murders, anarchist violence, the feuds of the Hatfields and McCoys, these lingered on in the folk memory, but on the whole, prosperity, temperance, and education had done their mollifying work. The crime rate dropped, feuds vanished, the police grew more courteous and professional, and men whose great-grandfathers had carried Bowie knives and Colt revolvers accoutred themselves with slide rules and attaché cases. It was unusual, even in New York City, for an apartment door to have a chain lock. An ordinary bolt sufficed to discourage vacuum cleaner salesmen, peeping toms, and the other nuisances of urban life. Burglar alarms were gewgaws for the ultra-rich. Heiresses and mobsters might be followed around by bodyguards, but ordinary citizens trusted the cops to come when needed, and come fast. In the early 60s, slowly at first, then with accelerating speed, the safety and civility of the mid-century America crumbled. One's chance of being robbed, raped, assaulted, or murdered nearly tripled between 1960 and 1980, with the biggest single jump in crime occurring in 1974. Crime was raging so desperately out of control that an entirely new system of counting it had to be invented. Since the 1920s, the FBI had calculated the crime rate by toting up reports to local police departments. Although academic criminologists might grumble about sloppy police record keeping, the FBI's method made good enough sense. When crime is generally low, confidence in the police will be relatively high, and most crimes, at least most serious crimes, will be reported. But as the crime wave of the 60s and 70s tore up American cities, citizens simply ceased bothering with the useless trip to the police station to report that their purses had been snatched, that they had been stabbed, that they had been raped. The police came under intensifying pressure from local political figures to protect their city's or town's image by shaving their reports. Future U.S. Attorney General Edward Levi estimated in 1973 that more than one-third of all crimes were going unreported. That same year, the Justice Department introduced a more scientific technique for measuring crime, the victimization survey. Pollsters interviewed statistical samples of the population and asked them whether they had suffered a crime in the past year. The first of the new reports arrived in the summer of 1975, and its results were horrifying. It found that 37 million Americans, meaning one household out of every 4, had suffered a rape, robbery, assault, burglary, larceny, or auto theft in 1973. In cities of more than 100,000 population, the victimization rate was one household out of every 3. A feeling of constant and imminent menace pervaded the country, and especially its big cities. The 1974 movie Death Wish captures the mood of dread. Charles Bronson plays a New York architect, a self-described bleeding heart liberal, whose wife is murdered and whose daughter is raped by 3 thugs who force their way into the family's apartment. The police do not catch the killers. They do not much try. They fill out forms, make some routine inquiries, and then forget about it. As a precinct captain explains, the city is suffering 30 murders a week. How could anyone investigate them all? A friend gives Bronson a gun, and he begins to prowl the streets and subways at night. Never has Manhattan looked more terrifying. The wind is chill, the streets are empty, the few law-abiding pedestrians pull their collars up around their ears and hear and see nothing. At first by accident, then deliberately, Bronson tempts muggers to attack him. It seldom takes him long. The criminals are lurking everywhere. They approach their victims in total arrogance, without even a glance over their shoulder for the police. They know the police aren't coming. And in fact, the only police action we see in the movie is a furious manhunt to capture Bronson, the vigilante killer. The corruption, indifference, or malevolence of the police is taken for granted in the decade's movies, and in particular its 2 most colossal commercial successes, The Godfather and The Godfather Part 2. In the first Godfather, a Sicilian man comes to Don Corleone because a bribed police officer has dropped the charges against his daughter's rapist. The Don reproachfully asks the man why he went to law instead of his friends. The makers of The Godfather were, of course, attempting to score an ironic mid-1970s point. The police and the courts are just as crooked as the gangsters, but the audiences that thronged the theaters were cheering Don Corleone without irony. Here, at last, was a leader who maintained order and dispensed justice, who upheld clear and certain rules and punished those who violated them, who heeded the moral sense of his community rather than championing those who defined its norms. A 1979 survey by the National Education Association discovered that 110,000 teachers, 1 out of every 20 members of the union, had been a victim of a physical attack by a student in the 1978-79 academic year. A Gallup survey taken in July 1975, in the middle of the worst economic downturn since 1937 and the steepest rise in the cost of living since the collapse of the Confederate dollar, asked city dwellers to name their worst problem. 50% cited inflation, 11% identified unemployment, 21% named crime. A majority of adults and more than 3/4 of women living in large cities told pollsters that they were afraid to walk in their own neighborhoods at night. The sociologist Jonathan Reeder lived for a year in the early 1970s in the Jewish and Italian New York neighborhood of Canarsie near Kennedy Airport. He described a meeting in a synagogue basement after a rash of muggings and beatings near the local subway station. An old man with a thick Yiddish accent demanded to know why the neighborhood cannot get more police. Quote, "So broken ribs and shoulders are not enough? We need a murder too?" Unquote. A somber elderly woman said, quote, "I'm locked up like in the ghettos of Europe," unquote. Quote, "I'm afraid of people knocking down my door. I still am not free," unquote. Back in a minute. Thank you. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president who was a hero to everyone in that basement, had declared freedom from fear, one of the 4 freedoms for which World War II was being fought. Only a decade before, New Yorkers had enjoyed that freedom. In November 1965, New York and the entire Northeast were plunged into darkness by a power failure. But the dimming of the lights did not unravel the fabric of civilization. Quote, "Although many merchants feared looting and violence, the police reported little such trouble. Many New Yorkers even seemed merry. There was the same air of revelry that often accompanies a heavy snowstorm," unquote, reported the New York Times the following morning. Only 5 people were arrested for looting. A dozen years later, on July 13, 1977, New York's power went out again. This time, New York exploded into horrifying urban mayhem. Quote, "The marauders had moved almost as though on signal at the start of the power blackout and continued brazenly through the daylight hours, even though city police were on full mobilization," unquote, the Daily News reported. Quote, "Youths in the Bronx could be seen trucking off supermarket goods in shopping carts. The looters had no pattern. Hit-and-run break-ins struck parts of Manhattan and Queens, and whole streets of stores were ripped off in Brooklyn and the Bronx. In the Bronx, thieves used the cover of darkness to steal 50 new Pontiacs from Ace Pontiac, 1921 Jerome Avenue at 177th Street. When the cars were recovered later in parts of the city, they were found stripped clean of parts. In Yonkers, a Molotov cocktail and eggs were thrown at passing patrol cars. 20 persons were arrested for looting in Getty Square near City Hall. In the Sunset Park section of Brooklyn, youths were seen driving their car up the sidewalk to a targeted store. Ropes or chains were tied between the protective grating of the store and the car's back bumper. The car then pulled away, the grating tumbled off, and the looters swept into the store," unquote. More than 550 policemen were injured. 4,500 looters were arrested. But almost certainly not punished. American society had made a quiet, collective decision in the 50s and early 60s to view crime more indulgently. This inclination to arrest and punish was inspired by 2 powerful emotions, pride and guilt. Pride. Mid-century Americans felt much more certain than we do now that they had unlocked the secrets of human behavior. In the era of B.F. Skinner, explaining human conduct in moralistic terms exposed one as sadly out of date. Just as madness had been transmuted into mental illness and idleness into unemployment, so crime was reinterpreted as delinquency, an unfortunate inability to bring one's conduct into line with the expectations of society. And as it was cruel and futile to jail the mentally ill and the unemployed, it was very nearly as foolish to jail the delinquent. The intelligent thing to do from everybody's point of view was to rehabilitate the delinquent, or, even better, prevent delinquency from arising in the first place by rooting out the causes of crime. True, there was awkward difficulty that nobody could agree on what those all-important causes might be. Was crime a psychological problem, or was it sociological? But whatever caused crime, thoughtful Americans refused to accept punishment as anything but a last desperate resort, and they judged the need for punishment a failure as much of society as of the delinquent himself. Guilt. In the 1960s, punishing crime stringently inevitably meant punishing blacks disproportionately. Before World War II, crime and race were two quite distinct subjects in the northern and western states. Of the 2,100 felons sentenced to New York State penitentiaries in the year ending June 1941, some 1,600 were white. The stereotypical criminal in the cities of the North was the Irish tough in his knit sweater and derby hat, and the Sicilian hoodlum with his greased hair and knife, or the Jewish bootlegger and pimp. Of the 2,100 convicts sentenced in 1941, 145 had been raised in what the state called the Hebrew faith. Between 1940 and 1960, however, some 2 million blacks migrated northward in search of better opportunities. As the sons and grandsons of these migrants came of age, the face of crime in the North and West darkened. In the 1960s, blacks, 12% of the population, committed more than half of the nation's serious crimes. Embarrassed judges and juries refrained from convicting and jailing criminals. Parole boards set parolers free earlier and with fewer questions asked. Reported crime rates more than doubled between 1960 and 1970, but the total number of criminals in prison actually fell from 212,953 federal and state inmates in 1960 to 196,429 in 1970. Policing lapsed. The population of the city of Los Angeles, for example, grew by 30% between 1950 and 1966. Over the same 16 years, the Los Angeles Police Department added 698 officers to its 1950 roster of 4,442, an increase of only 15%. The death penalty was quietly abandoned, although the number of murders in the United States jumped from 9,000 in 1960 to 15,000 in 1970, and more than 20,000 in 1975. Only 3 men suffered the maximum punishment for first-degree murder in the whole United States in the 14 years between 1965 and 1979, despite a Supreme Court decision in 1976 reaffirming capital punishment's constitutionality. Back in a minute. Thank you. Ex-convicts could no longer be denied the right to vote. The California Supreme Court held in a 7-0 decision in March 1973. In February 1975, Vaughn Booker of Pennsylvania, who was serving a life sentence for killing his wife, was made a deacon of the chapel of Graterford State Prison, the first convicted murderer ordained by the Episcopal Church. It neatly symbolized a new tenderness toward criminality when the New York Times in 1977 purged from its style book the rule that convicted felons were to be referred to only by their last names. Henceforward, they would be Mr., Mrs., or Miss, just like everyone else. Since the cause of crime was increasingly attributed to society rather than the criminal, the federal government and the states very logically hurled themselves with enthusiasm into the task of social reform. Building public housing, funding summer jobs for youth, boosting welfare payments, squeezing the unemployment rate toward 3%, outlawing discrimination in hiring, housing, and public accommodation, appropriating billions of dollars in federal aid for early childhood education, and on in fulfillment of all of the most precious hopes of every criminologist ever to bring home a degree from the fabled University of Chicago sociology department. No gardener ever attacked root causes more vigorously. Alas, the more tenderly society tried to salvage its delinquents, the more crime it got. We're still arguing over precisely what went wrong. Was it that welfare weakened family structures and multiplied the number of fatherless young men seeking to prove their manhood? Did criminals rationally assess the risks of getting caught and decide that crime paid better than it used to? Did the relatively declining pay for unskilled work after 1973 lure uneducated young men into criminal careers? Did a century of black rage and resentment finally explode into an undeclared guerrilla war? Or was it perhaps a little of each and every one of these explanations and a dozen others beside that caused the post-1960 crime surge? For our story, what matters is not the origins of the crime wave, but its result. In the span of a very few years, the exploitation of criminality utterly discredited the liberal ideas that had governed American public life since the war. It was already true in 1965 that a majority of Americans felt that the courts treated crime too leniently, but this sort of law and order conservatism remained a redneck view. In 1965, the majority of college-educated Americans still believed that the courts either were getting crime right or should become more lenient still. When the question about leniency of the courts was repeated in 1974, the college graduates were nearly as furious at the courts as their less credentialed neighbors. A crushing 85% majority damned the courts as too soft, and this time there was no difference between the replies of men and women or between high school dropouts and holders of postgraduate degrees. Between 1949 and 1973, the proportion of Americans expressing great confidence in the Supreme Court plunged from 83.4% to 32.6% in the University of Michigan's poll and to 28% in the Lou Harris poll, the steepest drop for any branch of government. Crime was to the liberalism of the 1960s, Moynihan observed, what communism was to the liberalism of the 40s. The issue that, quote, forced the left liberal intellectuals of the country to see that the masses really were not with them on issues of fundamental importance, unquote. Americans had trusted their political leaders, their university professors of criminology, their liberal newspaper columnists, their judges and district attorneys. And in return, their daughters had been raped, their mothers had been robbed on the way home from church, their cars stolen, their houses burgled. Understandably, they boiled with rage. In the 3 years, 1965 to 68, the proportion of Americans who said that they believed in the death penalty jumped to 48% from 38%. Over the next 8 years, the proportion jumped again to 67%. By 1997, 75% of Americans expressed support for the death penalty. It was crime that convinced Americans that George Wallace was right. Those pointy-headed know-it-alls in the black robes and at the college lecturer's rostrum really could not, quote, park a bicycle straight, unquote. After 1969, Richard Nixon's Supreme Court chipped away at the more extreme pro-defendant precedents of the Warren Court. Prison sentences extended longer, more cops were hired, new prisons built. Alas, it was like chasing a diesel train on a unicycle. By the late 1970s, some 40 million serious crimes were being committed in the United States a year. Only about 142,000 criminals per year were being sent to jail. Americans drew a stern conclusion from that grim arithmetic. If the authorities cannot and will not protect my family, I must do the job myself. Between 1959 and 1973, the percentage of Americans who owned a handgun jumped from 32% to 42%. Membership in the National Rifle Association tripled over the 15 years after the Watts riot, from 600,000 in 1964 to 1.9 million in 1981. Above all, Americans responded to crime they always have responded to bad situations, by hitching up their wagons. America was still, to a very surprising degree, a pre-suburban country in 1965. Camden, New Jersey, Oakland, California, Bridgeport, Connecticut, Gary, Indiana, and other smaller centers of heavy industry might have lost some of their railroad-age gleam, but Detroit, Chicago, Queens, Cleveland, and Los Angeles still throbbed with blue-collar life. If the great cities of America could not guarantee them the life they wanted, however, the urban working class was ready to move on, farther and farther out from the crime and welfare of the decaying cities. And these refugees from the ravaged cities of industrial America did not much appreciate it when the leaders whose policies they blamed for wrecking their old neighborhoods then told them that they were bigots for seeking homes where their kids can play on the streets without fear of having their bikes stolen. And that was Chapter 2 of Part 1 of How We Got Here, the 70s. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adieu to the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. Tomorrow is going to be Chapter 3 of Part 1 of How We Got Here, the 70s. So until then, I want to remind everybody to be smart, be beautiful, be honest, and to remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.